Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
All right, the 2025 NHL Entry Draft is almost upon us, and here to talk about it from Flow Sports, Chris Peters. How are you doing today, Chris?
Jesse, I'm doing great. It's always good to be with you. I feel like this time every year we get a chance to chat, and I always enjoy it. So it's great to be on with you and Zach here.
And of course, featuring Zach Dooley. How are you doing today, Zach?
Jesse, excited for the same reasons that Chris is, because he can make the draft more exciting for you and me.
Yeah. First things first, did I get that? It's been so long since I've done it. Did I even do the intro right? Featuring Zach Dooley. Is that what I used to say? Featuring Zach Dooley?
I thought you were going to ask Chris if you got his thing right. And I was just going to comment that, like, what a genius move it is to have his name and his affiliate in his bio. So, like, yeah. Jesse, who is notorious for messing that up, cannot mess it up.
Yeah. And listen, we've had recent guests whose little name tag were threw me for a loop. So.
Incorrect.
Super helpful there, Chris. We appreciate it.
I always enjoy when there's something completely off the cuff, like they were in the friend group and then they have to do it in a professional setting, and it's some very wrong nickname that shouldn't be repeated on a podcast. And then it's you're just like, whoa, but mine is always plain. I only use Zoom for official things like this here podcast.
Well, when we're done, don't hang up, and we'll tell you a story about that happening very recently.
Okay.
First things first, Chris. I every year, there are rumblings, and you hear stuff, and it's easy to ignore a lot of it. But this year, I've now heard from too many people in too many different places that because this is the first and potentially last decentralized draft, that the Combine has sort of replaced the draft from a social aspect, maybe not from, obviously the drafting doesn't happen at the Combine, but you were at the Combine. Was it substantially different this year as far as the number of attendees and the conversations that were happening?
I actually think it was pretty normal in regards, but what I would say is that there probably were a few more dinners. There were probably a few more extra meetings and different things that happened this year. I'm sure that teams traveled a little heavier than they normally would have to this as well. I don't have that. That's more anecdotally, since I'm there all the time. But, I think in the end, it felt like the regular Combine. The thing about it is that there is, I think the amount of weight that is put onto those next interviews that teams are going to have, where typically those would happen the week of the draft at, like trying to do it in secret and like, talking to this guy or that guy in some hotel room or in some conference room or at a restaurant. Those won't happen. But I think that in general, those are usually more, whoever wasn't at the Combine, maybe they get a chance to talk to these guys. So I just think that the briefings are going to have to be more robust and make sure everybody's on the same page about, what was learned ultimately from the Combine. But in the end, mostly the same as normal.
And I think Zach and I both know what the Combine is, but for anybody listening who has no idea what we're talking about, what happens at the what's the general schedule of events at the Combine?
It basically, the part that most people are familiar with is the physical testing, which is typically like the last thing that happens. The Combine has typically been going on for the week prior. So the players will get there on the Sunday of that week. They'll have their meetings. They're scheduled throughout their week. They'll have their dinners. There's media availability on Friday, and then Saturday is the testing. Additionally, they do the VO2 max test the Wingate test the day before they do the rest of the testing. So there's basically 2 days of testing. And then on top of that, there's also medical, physicals, measurements, different things like that happen, body composition and things of that nature. But yeah, that's kind of the way that it goes. It's a bit of a busy week for the players. Like some guys will meet with 28 teams. There was at least one kid that I talked to that's met with 31 teams. And I forgot to ask who was the team that they didn't meet with. But I think it's a pretty substantially busy week for those players. Highly intense, and the interview process is very important. The medical testing is very important. They'll do things like body composition and physiological kind of testing, which are very important. And then the physical testing is important, probably not as much as some of the other stuff that happens. But we also get those final heights and weights on that last day of testing as well, which for some players can be very significant, especially if they've gained or gained some weight or gained an inch or whatever it is. It can be very important.
It's actually a great segue, because I was reading your story, Chris, about who tested well, first, like leaders in certain categories at the combine, and it kind of got me thinking, like, what is really the most important part of the NHL Combine? Because obviously you'd want a player to be closer to first than last, right? But I also remember the famed story of Sam Bennett, who couldn't do a pull-up, and now he is thought of as like the peak playoff performer in the NHL. So like as a evaluator, like what's the most important thing for you for these kids this week?
I think definitely, to me, like the straight up most important thing, I think, is just kind of those interviews and that part, just players getting to, there's a lot to be learned about the players. I think teams learn about how self-aware is this player, how mature is this player. You talk to Matthew Schaefer and you can't help but come away but impressed with his overall kind of presence and his maturity and the things that he's gone through in his life. And then you might talk to somebody who's just really at a completely different maturity level and, maybe doesn't have as great a sense of who they are as a person or a player. And that shows in those things. When it comes to like the physical testing, though, what I think is important is that the players have to show that they're willing to compete. I think the pull-up thing is one of those where that's kind of part of it, where it's like, hey, player X can do 10 pull-ups, and now he's how many more reps is he going to fight for? You can get some sense of athleticism and explosiveness in some of the jumping drills that are done, like horizontal jump this year. We had a record set by Will Horkoff, who jumped 6.5 inches further than any other player. It just establishes, does that mean that he's going to be a better hockey player than Matthew Schaefer? No, but it just means that there's a level of athleticism in Will Horkoff that's different than some of his peers. So that's helpful to know as well. I think there's been talk about the VO2 max, how a player competes, like that's how hard are they willing to push themselves? And like Anton Frundell was a guy that came into the combine with fitness concerns from teams, and he had the best VO2 max score. So, it's kind of one of those things, which is kind of like an anaerobic fitness test. Well, he performed really well in that. And maybe that eases concerns a little bit, but it's just another small data point in a series of thousands that go into the process of drafting these players. So a lot of different things of importance. And you talk to teams and they will put different levels of importance on different parts of the combine as well. But I think, it's really important to kind of get more information, not all of the information.
Chris, I'm on record and somewhat notoriously as being opposed to the draft just as an institution. But one of the things that sort of fascinates me is that in the process of evaluating drafts, I'm going to use TV game shows as a sort of template here to talk about it. So I think people think about it the way you might think about Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, where you go like, there's an answer out there, and the trick is to find the answer, right? To know who's going to be the best player in the future. But if you're a team that's very good at drafting, there's 7 rounds, and it's a competition. You're drafting against 31 other teams. So you also have to be playing a little bit of Family Feud. You're not looking to guess who the best draft picks are going to be. You're looking to guess who the other 31 teams think the best draft picks will be, and then making your choices based around their choices. So as a journalist, when you're writing about these prospects and you're looking to, analyze the draft, and not only the draft, but how the different teams perform, are you approaching it trying to look at it like an episode of Jeopardy or an episode of Family Feud? Are you trying to figure out who's going to be the best pick, or are you trying to figure out who's best at knowing, if we asked 100 people, their favorite flavor of ice cream, what's the answer?
Yeah, I definitely think it's more Jeopardy style for me for what I do.
Mm-hmm.
But there is an element of the other side. And I think like as we are reporting on the draft and as we do things like mock drafts, that's obviously the path that we're taking. When we're putting our rankings together, it's more like, who do we think is going to be the best player? I think it is interesting, and you're going to see a lot of different varying viewpoints on this draft class, especially, even as far as even number one. I think that there's a majority opinion that Matthew Schaefer is number one, but there's probably a minority opinion out there that maybe it's Michael Miso or someone else that is going to ultimately be the best player. You're going to get a lot of different answers if you go to those 32 teams. I think when you're trying to plot out a draft board, and I think teams definitely are going to do this too, you want to try to find out who do we know they like, who do we know, what do we know about them, and maybe you make a few decisions about your board that way. If there are players you're super passionate about, do we need to have, say, a Brady Martin higher on our list because he's probably going to go before we have a chance to get him, and we want to just make sure that we have him appropriately slotted. But to me, I think the easiest path for everybody is to simply go by your list, make it within the vacuum, if you will, of who the best player is going to be. And then whatever happens, and you have prepared for all contingencies because you've ordered your list, and you're unlikely to run out of players on your list every year because the lists vary so much, especially as you get past the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and all those different things. And some teams might only end up listing 75 guys or something, but they're pretty certain that, those guys are going to be there. So it's always fascinating to see. But I think this year in particular, it's going to be as hard as it's ever been once we get outside of that top few picks to see how it ultimately shakes out from there, because there isn't a lot of consensus and you're going to hear a lot of differing opinions.
So that's one of the sort of fascinating things to me about the draft. And as you were saying all that, I was trying to find a draft that would be a perfect example of what I was talking about, because when we're talking about deep drafts or strong drafts, generally speaking, to me, that means like, okay, the top 10 is full of guys that I've heard of, or even the first round, right? Yeah. Like everybody goes back to whatever the 2003 draft, and you're going through the first round and you're like, oh my God, look at all these names. I know all of these people. But if I go back to 2016, which I grant you is, a decade ago, Austin Matthews was first overall. No, all right, everybody gets it. Patrick Laine was second. Pierre-Luc Dubois was third. And you can, if you want to, quibble with the careers of Laine and Dubois, but, looking at whatever. But then Puljujärvi is, I'm sure I butchered that name, apologies, is fourth. Matthew Tkachuk is sixth. So you go, okay, well, two somebodies, arguably four somebodies, got that hideously wrong. But as I go down the rest of the draft, because that's six names, but there were, 211 people drafted. So, how, when we're considering the strength of a draft, how deep are we getting before we start going, okay, well, every year there's more than 200 kids taken. And the reality is more than 50% of them will not become household names, if even have NHL careers. So,
yeah. So one of the things that I've learned in this whole thing, Jesse, is prepare to be humbled, because even the very best at this do not get it right 100% of the time. It's pretty rare that they get the number one pick wrong, but it is but it happens. And I think, one of the drafts that I think about is the Nico Hischier, Nolan Patrick draft. The argument the entire second half of the season was Nolan Patrick versus Nico Hischier. No one was talking about Cale Makar. No one was talking about Miro Heiskanen as number one picks. Towards the end, you started to hear some rumblings that maybe one of the defensemen is actually the best player in the draft. But people were so nervous to draft Cale Makar first overall out of the AJHL. That he wasn't playing at UMass yet. He didn't have that. So it is such an inexact science. And I think this is a year where I feel like, here's the thing. We're talking about Matthew Schaefer as the no doubt number one guy, and he hasn't played since December. And to me, that is fodder for risk. And the door is wide open. James Higgins is a guy that we talked about at the beginning of the year as a number one pick, and suddenly he might go, on some lists he's 8th, 9th. First of all, I think that's nuts. But second of all, I think that we pick these guys apart so much that we kind of sometimes overthink it and then get into this trouble. And it happens with NHL teams too. And I think, you watch the playoffs every year and you say, well, obviously we need to be bigger and stronger. Otherwise we can't win. And I keep thinking about, I was like, it wasn't that long ago that Patrick Kane was winning Conn Smythe trophies and being one of the best playoff performers. I mean, sorry to bring him up. I know that's LA Kings fans know all too well how that can go. But this idea that because James Higgins is 5'10" and a half and not 6'2", that he can't be the best player in this draft, I think is nuts. I'm not going to have him number one on my list, but he's still one of the top players to me. And so I think that there is so much wiggle room in this year's draft for the best player to not go number one, even though I think that Matthew Schaefer, pound for pound, and with the evidence that we have, is the best player in this draft and has the highest upside of any player in this draft. But it is certainly uncertain. And I think that's the thing you kind of have to always remember, is that there is a lot of time. And prepare to be humbled, prepare to be wrong. And I can't wait to hear everybody tell me how wrong my list is or whatever else list is with what happens on draft day. We'll see is probably the most important words that you'll say about a prospect, because it's going to take some time.
It's always interesting too, because you don't know if you were right or wrong for 4 or 5 years too, yep. at the least, when these guys actually become potentially who they are, which I think makes it, everyone wants these immediate grades on a draft. It's you really shouldn't be grading drafts for 5 to 7 years, which is pretty crazy, right?
Right. And the thing is that, we all do the redrafts because, one, people love them, and two, there is new information that you get with each subsequent year. But I can't tell you how many times I've done a redraft where I wrote a guy off and all of a sudden he's fine. That's the thing. So you're right. Yes, it is often too early. I think if you're going to redraft, you better redraft every draft every year to see how your redrafts have gone, because it's going to change. And I think in this year, we've talked about the weakness of this draft in terms of the shallowness of this draft. And part of it is in part because there are so many guys that have so many questions about what they ultimately are going to be. And that can be scary, but it also leaves a lot of room for growth. I mean, development is not a straight line. I say it all the time and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Some of these guys are going to peak early. Some of these guys are going to peak later. Some of these guys might not peak at all. I mean, that's just kind of the way that it goes. So I think whether you're picking, in the top 12 or in the bottom 10 of the first round, there's still ample opportunity for you to get value. It's just, what is your process like? How did you arrive at that decision? If you can defend it adequately, then you're still going to have a job, because nobody can get it right all the time.
So is that maybe what makes this draft intriguing for a team like the Kings, who picked 24, where, Matthew Schaefer, unless everyone believes your theory that he's less athletic than Will Horkoff, he won't be available to the Kings unless 23 teams pass on him for some reason. So is it fair to say that anyone the Kings pick or any team in that range picks, there's probably going to be question marks around that player, but it might be the same level of question mark at, I don't know, 10 to 15 as it is at 20 to 25 in this draft?
Yeah, for me, I see a drop off essentially after about 13. And which I think, like, in deeper drafts, you might see that drop off. There's going to be a drop off after, like, you know, the top, whatever, 3, 4, 5, you know, the 10, you can tier it however you want to. Deeper drafts, I think usually 24, you're still feeling like you're going to get something of pretty high value. But as we learn over time and watch drafts, your odds are significantly lower in the bottom third of the first round to get an impact player. That said, again, it comes down to your process and how do players fall? Who do you value? You might get a guy that's really high on your list at 24, especially this year. So I think that there's still a lot of you know, things that can be figured out. And I think, you know, a team like the Kings, like, they're going to go through the process so in depth, and they're going to know whoever they take at 24 forwards and backwards, and they're going to love them, no matter, you know, because that guy was appropriately slotted on wherever their list was, and they feel really good about it. But again, yeah, the questions that will be there, you know, you're going to get a fairly incomplete player. You're going to get a player that is going to need a lot of work, but then you turn him over to your development staff, and it gives you that opportunity to maybe mold this player. I think that the development portion is something we probably don't talk enough about at the draft time. If you have a good development system, if you have a good AHL team, if you have guys that are out and about in the junior rinks and working with these players, out and about in the college rinks working with these players, which every team has now, you know, you've got enough touch points to maybe help that player reach their full potential. And I think that's, you know, again, the scouts can only do so much. Once they draft that player, the pick is done, and now it's off to the development staff. And it's also up to the player to see, you know, if they're going to make it.
I want to drill down on the concept of development for a second, because this is the fight that I've been having for years now. And I feel like I must be doing a bad job explaining myself because I keep having the same conversation. I heard somewhere, I don't even remember where anymore, that the Kings have the highest number of drafted players currently not playing for the team that drafted them. And so then the question becomes, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right. And on the one hand, you could say, well, it's a great thing because you're giving yourself NHL currency in drafting players who are, you know, capable of playing for other teams, and then you can trade them and you can recoup assets. But if you look at, and this is sort of where we're going to focus the question, I think, for now, Chris, the idea is that 200 games is the threshold for judging a good draft pick. But if you look at some of those players who are out there in the league that were drafted by the Kings with more than 200 games to their name, you've got Jacob Middleton, who was a 7th round draft pick. You've got the forward whose name I'm totally blanking on right now, who we traded to Chicago for a 5th round pick, Dominic Kubalik, who was a 5th round pick, or traded for a 5th round pick. You've got Johnny Brodzinski in New York, who I think is just shy of 200 games, but coming up on it soon. You know, there's all these kids out there that were drafted by the Kings when, at the time that they left the organization, they were either allowed to walk or, you know, the trade return was very low. And so the idea that that was a good, you know, that in some way stocked the cupboard with NHL currency isn't necessarily relevant. And yet I'd still rather have a team that can find those gems, because, you know, one never knows, right? Like Matt Roy was allowed to walk in free agency, but the Kings still got his services for however many years. I mean, that is not without, obviously it's worth tremendous value. It would have been worth more value if they had made it out of the first round, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think that the way we view draft picks is that it is a failure if they didn't play for your team. Mm-hmm. And I think that's incorrect. I think that they're failures if you didn't sign. If that player wasn't even good enough for you to sign to a contract, then that was a failed draft pick, you know. But can I jump in real quick? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I want to use the example of Michael Eyssimont, who's, I believe, in Winnipeg right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zach.
Seattle.
Okay, Seattle. Thank you. When Eyssimont was allowed to leave the Kings organization, I don't think anybody felt that that was the wrong decision for him or for the Kings, right? The Kings had depth. They were going for a different direction than holding on to a player like him would mean. But he's proven that he can have himself a career, and he's an NHL player, and like no harm, no foul in my mind. And yet it sounds like what you're about to say is that was a misstep to allow him to leave the organization.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I don't think so, because I think that the thing was the information that the Kings had on Eyssimont in particular, and I had to look it up just to jog my memory of his time there. He was within the system. Like, he's in the system, plays for the Reign, never had a season with the Reign that suggested that he was taking the step. But then he goes into a new situation, and he has a great season in the AHL with the Manitoba Moose. Different situation, put in a different and that situational stuff, like the one thing about, we talk about development, situation just as important. We just had Chris Pronger on my podcast, and we had this discussion about fit, and he talked about, when he went to Hartford, if he didn't have Brad McCrimmon with him, he would have gotten eaten alive. And some guys, if they go into an AHL organization, it might not be the right fit. They might not have the right pieces around them to succeed. And that's not really the organization's fault. It's not the player's fault. It just is. And it's part of what makes this so difficult, is because it's difficult to know what the right situation even is for those players. So I think what I'd say is like, if you draft a guy, and let's say even if you don't sign him to an NHL contract, but you get him into your AHL system, you've identified a player and then they play. They've created some level of value for your organization, because I think the AHL is extremely important for what happens at the NHL. And every guy on that roster, whether he is a prospect or not, is getting the organization to a different place. So I know I'm rambling a bit here, but the point is, essentially, and maybe not just specific to Eyssimont, but other players, that there are so many ways to generate value from a draft pick, regardless. And I even think if you get a guy that helps your AHL team, that is still value for your NHL team. Like it's hard to, people don't like that because it's not, if they didn't make it to the NHL, then what's the point? Well, that's not really realistic. The small percentage of players that make it to the NHL, but these are the guys that kind of help them get there. So I don't think I ever saw, like, I knew what Mikey Eyssimont was as a college player, and I was impressed by him. But what I didn't anticipate was that he was going to be able to play, a bottom six role for the Tampa Bay Lightning for a full season, that he was going to be a piece that they were able to use in a trade to get something of value back. Those are the types of things that you're not necessarily certain about, but it worked out well. So I think a player like that, who you drafted in the 5th round, who played in your organization for a few years, didn't quite pan out at the NHL level, and he moved on, still there's some level of success that you could take out of that without it being it's not a total loss, even though it might not have helped you at the NHL level.
Chris, I want to take you back kind of to this year's draft. If you look at where the Kings are at currently in that prospect pool, I think they've had a lot of guys either graduate or age out. You've got Liam Greentree at the top. You've got the 3 goaltenders behind him, George Slukinski-Portillo. And then you have probably a lot of discussion on who the next best skater would be in the pool. I'm wondering, with that approach, with kind of maybe a lot of guys who could forecast into depth NHLers, less so on the high end, does that leave this draft in your mind as maybe like a wide open approach for a team like the Kings, because they really could afford to add at like a number of different positions within their prospect pool?
Yeah, I think flexibility is good. I mean, I've been of the mind, I know there are people that'll say, well, we have a lot of left shot defensemen. We have a lot of right shot defensemen. We have a grinding third line winger in our AHL system. I think the thing is if you think that this player is going to factor into your organization, you really can't focus much on positionality unless we're talking at the very top of the draft. And you're saying, I think in most cases, if it's close between a center and a defenseman, you're going to take the center because you can generate some more value out of it. If it's close between a defenseman and a winger, you're going to take the defenseman. If it's close, you go on down the list and you prioritize. But what I think is that if you like all of these players, you're kind of playing the odds, and not every right wing that you draft is going to be a right wing. Not every center that you draft is going to be a center. Like there's all these kinds of different scenarios that play out. So yeah, I think you take the wide open approach. You just build your list as who are the best players, where, and not really, you don't ignore. But what I think teams, especially like the Kings and a lot of teams do, as opposed to drafting for need, they draft for fit, and fit can mean a lot of different things. Fit can mean this player plays our style of hockey. Fit can mean this is a player that does have a positional, like fits our positional needs, and we lack depth there. And you might build your draft list saying, hey, we know the things that are not super strong in our system. Can we address that in this draft class? And if you can without going completely off the board, then you do it. But I still think that you take the approach of not really considering entirely what the rest of your, especially those later round picks, the odds are not in your favor to begin with. So don't decrease the odds by pigeonholing players and saying, we need a right shot defenseman. If you get that, that's an added bonus. It's just, I think you're ultimately looking for players regardless of where they play, because you need players and you need assets, and that's all you're looking to add.
The Kings find themselves in an unusual situation heading into this draft, in that Rob Blake is no longer the general manager. Ken Holland was named shortly after the departure of Rob Blake. And so you have a scouting staff that has been in place for a long time. You have an organizational stability that's been in place for a long time. And yet you have a general manager who is brand new, but has publicly stated that he'll turn over running the draft to Mark Yannetti, the director of amateur scouting. Now, obviously, if somebody comes to the Kings and offers a roster player in exchange for a draft pick in a trade, obviously Ken Holland will weigh in on that decision, right? That is not going to be left up to Mark Yannetti. But it seems like Mark Yannetti will be given sort of free rein to operate the draft and worry about the draft picks on his own. And based on conversations that we've had with Mark Yannetti in the past, he seems to have a much more fluid approach, shall we say, to drafting. He was interested in trading down. And so does that, introduce any wrinkles into how you look at the draft coming up?
I don't think so. I think, especially with, obviously Mark Yannetti has been doing this for a long time. And I think that, Ken Holland as a GM has traditionally turned a lot of those decisions over to his amateur scouting staff. And, he has the scouting background, so you trust his opinions on things. But I don't recall a time that I heard that he superseded what the director of amateur scouting and the scouting staff wanted to do. Because he's been in that position. He understands how hard it is and how much work goes into it. There are absolutely been times where general managers with similar experience have said, nope, we're going this way. And has made mistakes as a result, quite frankly. And I can think of a few specific examples that I won't throw anybody under the bus here. But at the same time, I think that, the marching orders from up top always have to be, here's what we're looking to do. How do we execute this plan? And that's the framework within which you hope your director of scouting works within. I think this year, especially with the trades, it just seemed like, and this was true at the trade deadline, how many 2026 picks went instead of 2025 picks? And I think it's going to be difficult. Like if you trade down from 24, what ultimately is the value you're going to be able to garner from that? Probably an extra draft pick, but really, you're hoping that a team is like desperate for a player at that point. I think every option has to be on the table for the Kings here. They've done a nice job. Like, certainly there have been guys that have worked and there have been guys that haven't, but they've generally done a nice job of their what's within their system now. And I don't think it makes much sense to change that approach. And I don't think that that's what Ken Holland is going to want. And I don't think that that's what Mark Yannetti is going to do. I think that he's had the experience that he's had and has a process. I mean, you could say whatever you want about, you might disagree with the decisions, but there's absolutely always been a process within what the Kings do. And that's always been evident, I felt. So that, and there are a lot of things that they do that are unconventional at times. Drafting Hampton Slakinski was unconventional. But that is looking real good right now. And he's progressing in such a way where just trust me, like drafting Minnesota high school goalies is just generally not something people do. And that's worked out. So I think you trust in that group. There's a good crew there too. I mean, it's obviously beyond Mark Yannetti and the staff that he's assembled. Very experienced, very capable. So I think they're on a good track, and really they're in a weird stage now because obviously you're a team that feels like you should be competing and going for, getting back into that cycle of going for the Stanley Cup. And I think that you do have to put everything on the table. And if there's a good trade there that makes you better sooner, then I think you have to explore it because, quite frankly, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's next. But if there's a team that has enough high value on that pick, it'd be pretty easy to let it slide by.
So who are the Kings taking?
Oh boy, I wish I could tell you. That's the thing. I mean, I think in this draft, I could give you kind of like the range of guys that could be available there that could be interesting. And I can also tell you that there's a chance that some of these guys get drafted 15th overall, or maybe they get drafted. Maybe they don't go until the mid-second round. But you look at what's kind of available in that range, and I think that there is going to be the second tier of defensemen. You should be able to find somebody in there if that's the way you want to go. I think guys like Blake Fidler, Sasha Boumediene, probably to a lesser extent, I think we're hearing more about Cameron Reed is rising up charts. But maybe a Logan Hensler is available there from the University of Wisconsin. And that's a wide range of defensemen. Hensler is kind of more defensive style, really good skater. Boumediene has more of that offensive kind of game, but he's a solid defender and elite skater. And then, you look at a Blake Fidler who has the size and might be more of a stopper and he has at least some quality NHL, tools, but is going to require more development time. You could look kind of down at some of these two-way aggressive wingers and centers. Milton Gastrin from Sweden played primarily in the U20 ranks this year, but was a really impressive guy. Was the captain of the under-18 team this season. Plays a hard-driving game. He's physical, and he's a pretty good skater for, it doesn't look great, but I think he gets to where he needs to go. Malcolm Spence, more of this kind of hard-nosed, physical guy that probably isn't going to pop in a ton of points, but he has good enough size, good enough strength. He's going to the University of Michigan. He's one of these CHL guys that's taking the new college route. So those are the types of players that I think could be available in that range. Then there are other guys where it's like, hey, maybe we take a little bit more of a swing. Maybe we look at a little bit more upside. Do we not worry about size as much? Maybe take a Ben Kindle, who's got exceptional playmaking ability. Not an amazing skater, not very big, but he has this really high processing game. I think other guy, Bill Zonin from Rune Naranda and in the QMJHL, he did a really nice job at the Combine, but he also showed a lot of upside this year, but still some raw ability that's going to need to be mined a little bit more to see where he's at. Or maybe it's a guy like we saw Will Horkoff, where he does go in that range, and he's got size, he's got physicality, he's got NHL bloodlines. He went to college at the midway point of last season and actually played better than he did in junior, and he looked better than he did in college, and that's a huge credit to him to make that transition mid-season. And then he came back to the under-18 Worlds, played within his own age group, and again looked better, and so I think those are the types of players that we're talking about in that range. But like I said, it's hard to know. Some of those guys could be gone by 20. Some of those guys might not go till the second round. But those are the kinds of players that I think would at least fit within the way they've drafted in the past, and what could potentially be there. There's other guys too, like the big guys, like, you get a Liam Greentree last year. Well, if you've watched a lot of Liam Greentree, maybe Jack Nesbitt will be available, another Windsor Spitfires guy. He might be available in that range, and he's huge, big guy, physical, power forward style, not a great skater, but really does a lot of things well, has some real good touch around the net. Those are the types of players that we're talking about.
If you look at last year, the Kings did get a Liam Greentree. They were at 20. They traded back to 26. They still got Greentree, and they added, that second in Carter George. If you look at what the Kings did last year, 1 year out, not to ask you to redraft or anything like that, but it feels like the picks that the Kings made last year have aged pretty well. Liam Greentree obviously had an outstanding year in the OHL. Jared Woolley won the Memorial Cup. Carter George faced like 1 billion shots in the OHL this year. Those three in particular, and James Reeder had a nice year at Denver. Where do you kind of see maybe the class of 24 at 1 year out? It was small, but it did seem to be pretty impactful.
Yeah, I think it looks pretty solid. I mean, certainly to see what Greentree did this year in junior, wasn't necessarily a huge surprise. I mean, like, he is a tremendous player. There are still going to be concerns about general things about his game that he's going to have to clean up over time, but he's progressed, and you need to see that progression. He also had a tremendous postseason, which I think was important for him because, there's been questions about his overall compete level and drive and different things like that, which, to me is a little bit outside of what you expect from Kings prospects, but he still has this tremendous offensive upside in a big frame. And that's great. I think Carter George is really one of those guys where he does not have the prototypical NHL goalie size, but in that same way that Jonathan Quick was so cerebral and athletic and all of these different things that he's able to do, Carter George took another step this year. And I thought what really impressed me is when he got some time with Ontario and seeing that transition. He played well at the World Juniors, but I expected him to play well at the World Juniors. I didn't necessarily know how things were going to go when he got a couple of AHL games. And it's a very small sample, but to me, the thing that separates him is that hockey sense of his, that demeanor that he has. And those things are translatable, even though he's not the biggest guy. So I think that you feel confident. You're not out of the woods. You're not necessarily going to say, well, we did our job. We're good. Everything's fine. We got a good class. But like, all of those players had success this season, progressed this season. And that's all you can ask for from these players. You're going to make decisions to make. Some guys already signed, and then you're going to have others that you're going to have to make a decision on, like James Reeder, but they have time. And so I think, when you get 4 picks and you see a guy pop 100 points, you see a goalie transition into your AHL team seamlessly, you see a guy win a Memorial Cup and also definitely took a big step forward in his overall game, and then James Reeder playing a substantial role on a competitive college hockey team, those are all real positive things. So you're happy with where you're at. You don't count you don't say, all right, we did it, we're good, but you feel good about where it's going.
I want to revisit the concept of fit, talking about Liam Greentree, Chris, and this is, we're going deep into King's weeds here, not draft stuff. I apologize in advance, but Liam Greentree, 6'3". He scored 119 points in 64 games, then 24 points in 11 games in the playoffs. He's 19 years old. He'll turn 20 in January. And in a world devoid of context, I look at Liam Greentree and I go, boy, I can't wait to see him on the LA Kings. But in a world flush with context, I go, I have no idea where he plays if he plays on the LA Kings. At least this year. I mean, now there's plenty of summer left and trades could happen and free agent signings could happen and things could change. But I look at Liam Greentree and I go, well, he can't go to the AHL to start the season. So he's probably back in Windsor where he just scored 120 points in, 60 some games. Like, I don't really have a question there other than like, what are we doing as an industry?
Yeah. If we could go back in time, just and tell Liam to maybe put the pen down and not sign the contract,
right.
He would have been eligible to go to the NCAA this year. But because he is assigned to an NHL contract, that is no longer an option for him. That is the route that a number of players like him that would be kind of tweeners, because I don't think there is a spot for him on the Kings next year, and I don't think he's ready to play for the Kings next year. I could certainly be surprised by it, but there's a lot of things that I think are going to have to happen for him to really find and establish a role. Could he get those 9 games? I think that would maybe make sense, but now you're in the spot where you do have to send him back to junior. I am going to be fascinated to see what happens with the next CBA and how we decide to do things with some of these players. Will the AHL rule go away because all of these players are leaving for college otherwise?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, hey, would you rather go to college or would you rather play in the AHL? And for some players, the decision is going to be, I'm going to go play pro hockey. And the other, but that's not an option for Liam Greentree right now. What I think makes sense for him overall, though, is that, he'll go back to junior. He'll be a dominant player. He'll get an opportunity that he didn't have last year in playing for Canada at the World Junior Championship, I would assume. He didn't make it last year. Maybe he will this year, but I do know that there's, that's going to be a very competitive team to make, and I wouldn't guarantee him a spot, even with as good of a season that he had last year. I think he's likely, but I just couldn't guarantee it. So I think that's going to be something to kind of track, but really for, as an industry, I think things are going to change because of this NCAA rule, because of, the AHL could potentially miss out on some of these 19-year-old players, 20-year-old players that are kind of skipping that step because college is kind of that good hybrid between junior and pro, which a lot of these players are doing. So I think that's going to be kind of interesting to follow over time. But yeah, I think as far as Liam Greentree is concerned, he'll end up where he needs to next year. My guess is that it's in junior. And yeah, as much as he performed and like his postseason was ridiculous. 14 goals in 11 games. There's so many things to like about where his game is. I still don't think that he has completely mastered it, So there's going to be things that he's going to be able to work on and get better in. But if we were having the same discussion about like Gavin McKenna, who is clearly outgrown junior hockey, and even though he's much younger and not draft eligible until next season, he kind of almost has no choice but to go find something else to challenge him. And unfortunately, that's just not going to be an option for Liam Greentree.
So I just want to do a little bit of house cleaning on what we were just talking about, because it occurs to me that some people listening might have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, I always forget that. Thank you for this. Yes,
because I'm talking to my uncle who is a diehard Sens fan, and he's asking me about the sport, and I'm starting to get into stuff, and he's like, "Wait, what?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, some people don't get into the weeds." So the issue that you raised with Greentree is that if you've signed an entry-level contract, you're ineligible to play under NCAA rules. And
Correct.
There was a recent change where players could transfer from the Canadian Hockey League to then go play in the NCAA, which, and you can correct me because I don't know this one yet fully, but doesn't that effectively change their career trajectory as far as when they're allowed to sign an NHL contract?
Yeah, so this
or
is kind of
play in the NHL, not sign.
Yeah, so this is a kind of a limbo state that we're in that people are still trying to figure out. But in general, if you sign a professional contract and receive funds that are over and above living expenses, essentially, you are no longer eligible to play in the NCAA. The rule as it was before was that if you play in the CHL, that was considered a league that you were not allowed to play in. It wasn't, basically there wasn't a good reason for it in the end, which we know now, it wouldn't have stood. There was a lawsuit that happened, and that's why it changed. And in the age of NIL and everything else, it's,
which stands for name, image, likeness, by the way.
Name, image, and likeness. Yep. I caught myself that time.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other factor as well in this thing. But yeah, so the other factor is that typically when you've been drafted out of the CHL, your draft rights are held for 2 years. The team has to sign you within 2 years. The way it sounds like it's going to work now is if a player leaves junior hockey, goes to college hockey, that team will retain their rights for 4 years. Now, that hasn't been 100% confirmed. And as the CBA is written currently, I'm not sure how that works. But there are players that are going to be within that 2 years of being drafted that have gone to college hockey. And so I'm like, well, do they have to sign? And then, because they can be re-entered in the draft if they don't sign within that first 2 years, if they're age eligible still. So there's a lot left to be sorted out. In general, though, if you are a player that has any thoughts of playing college hockey, you can't sign an NHL contract. And teams will, typically want to sign their high picks as early as they can, have some control over them. But I think teams will also be actively pursuing this NCAA route and trying to figure that out a little bit more.
The reason I bring it up is that it has always occurred to me that if I was running, if I'm in charge of, franchise mode on NHL 2000, on NHL 25, and I'm just doing it on my Xbox at home, when I'm drafting exclusively out of collegiate and European ranks because it just gives me an extra 2 years to worry about the development of my prospects. Right. And I don't have to worry about it. And so even though it's not a sensible way to run a business because, you pass up on, Connor McDavid didn't play in the NCAA, and to avoid drafting him just because of that would be silly. But, now all of a sudden you have these lawsuits and these big things, and between the NCAA reduce, like a 19-year-old can come from the NCAA straight to the NHL, but can't come from Windsor straight to the NHL. Or rather can go, excuse me, I've got that backwards. Apologies, everybody listening. A 19-year-old could play for the Ontario Reign. Yeah. But if he came from Finland or college, but Liam Greentree can't play for the Ontario Reign. It's got to be the Kings or Windsor. So now on top of that, you add in the name, image, likeness rules, which basically says that colleges can pay students to play for them. How much longer does the CHL have before we start really, getting rid of some of these protectionary rules?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you, because the crazy part of it is that now they're losing more of their older players to college hockey. So it almost makes that rule more important to them in some way to keep players that are age eligible there. But the way that it sounds like the winds are blowing, I think the OHL, the WHL, the QMJHL all are kind of resigned to the fact, not really resigned, but understanding of this is a new era. We are going to be younger. So in the end, they will probably get more better players at ages 16 and 17 than they've ever gotten before. Because you think about Adam Fantilli wanted to maintain college eligibility, so he played in the USHL. Same with Macklin Celebrini. And a number of other high-profile Canadian players. Now they can go play for their whatever team drafted them in the OHL and still maintain that college eligibility. So there's a lot that needs to be sorted out. I do think that it will be a large topic within the CBA. I think that there is reluctance from the agent side and the NHLPA side to increase the length of draft rights for players, just because having team control without a contract is a little bit, difficult for them, and that's not something that they particularly enjoy. But basically at this point, we're still all in wait and see mode. This is the first summer where it's happening. We expect a lot of players to go to the college route, and then a lot of players in the CHL to get younger. We've already seen players that have moved from the USHL to the OHL. So there's a lot of different things that kind of are going to come into play, but it's going to be very, very, very tough to figure out. And I think we're all going to be learning as we go.
Well, I certainly didn't expect the conversation to go here. I apologize, but thanks for shedding some light on it. It's one of those things where, every now and then I'll talk to my dad and, he'll be saying, well, they should get this guy or that guy or trade this guy or that guy. And I'll go, right, but the salary cap. And he'll sort of hand wave me away and go I don't care about all that. And I go, okay, but but it exists, and like
Yeah,
the business side of the industry does matter.
It does, and it impacts literally everything.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like in this new rule is the single largest transitional and just crazy change that we've seen within hockey's landscape, which feeds the NHL. So it impacts everything. The entire ecosystem is shifting, and we don't know where it's going to go. And for some people, that's scary. For me, I'm excited because I think that there's a lot of opportunity. There is a chance where everybody wins a little bit here. It's going to be hard, and hopefully that, you know, teams and leagues that collaborate and all that stuff will ultimately succeed from this. But it is there's going to be growing pains, and there's going to be a lot of learning, but it is massively impactful for what we're going to see in the NHL in the next 10 to 15 years here.
I fully expect the Kings to be on top of all of these changes and be aware of them and factor into their draft strategy. So draft coming up. Chris Peters, thank you very much. Zach, thanks as always for joining. And thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.